everyone. So we have the homeostasis lecture and I'm going to split it up into a couple of parts. So starting with part one, starting with homeostasis, and we're actually going to start with a few fun facts. For example, why do birds sometimes stand on one leg? The answer to this has to do with basically temperature regulation. They stand this way in colder weather because holding the leg close to the body helps keep the bird warm. Why do toucans have such large beaks? Again, temperature regulation. That when flying on hot days, a toucan can direct more blood flow to the beak, where the passing air cools it. The large beak also helps radiate heat to cool down the body, so at night they'll cover their beak to decrease heat loss. Why do small male garter snakes emit female pheromones in early spring? Again, the answer to this has to do with temperature regulation. That a male who has just emerged from hibernation is so cold that it can have trouble moving. So it'll emit some of those female pheromones to kind of attract the larger male garter snakes that'll kind of swarm all over the smaller one, try in an attempt to mate. But the warmth from the others can then help that smaller male to move on its own. Okay, anyway, you probably are sensing a theme, which is temperature regulation. So we know that temperature affects many aspects of behavior. Temperature regulation is very important for a lot of processes, physiological and behavioral. The idea of homeostasis has to do with some different processes, and temperature regulation is one of these, but different processes that help keep certain body variables within a fixed range. Sometimes the fixed range is so narrow that it's basically the set point. Some examples are levels of water, that our body needs a certain amount of water to function properly. We also need a certain amount of oxygen, glucose, calcium, and so forth. The book talks, the book talks about the analogy with a thermostat. So when you set your thermostat, let's say you're setting it to 72, if the temperature in your home is above 72, then the thermostat's going to kick in, get the AC going to bring it down to 72. If the temperature in your home is lower than 72, then the furnace is going to kick in, get some heat to get it back to that set point. So homeostasis, this process is basically about regulation, and regulation processes that we're not consciously aware of, like our body just does it, which I think is super cool. So our bodies want to be in a state of equilibrium. We want to have this balance. We want to have homeostasis. We want to be in our fixed range or set point. Sometimes if there is a discrepancy, if we're too cold than we ought to be, or if we don't have enough water that we need, then we'll engage in negative feedback, which is the process to reduce the discrepancy to get back to our set point. Allostasis has to do with some changes of the set point in response to some changes in life or changes in the environment. One thing we can see with our own body temperature, we have fluctuations throughout the day and night, where we tend to have higher temperature during the day than at night, and this is regardless of what the room temperature is. We'll talk a little bit later about fever, that in that kind of situation, there might be that change of set point, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Let's see. We were going to talk about this in class, but to think about where does most of our energy go. Of course, we do use a lot of energy for different processes, for muscles, for mental energy, but a lot of our energy goes towards temperature regulation. Basal metabolism is this maintaining a constant body temperature while at rest. And we see that about 2/3 of our energy goes towards regulating our temperature. There are some species that are poikilothermic or ectothermic, which means that their body temperature matches that of the environment. So this is a lot of amphibians, reptiles, and most fish. So they lack an internal mechanism to regulate their own body temperature. They really rely on the environment. A lot of people call these animals cold-blooded, which can be a little bit misleading because, if they're cold, they'll move into like a sunny, sit out on the sun on a sunny rock or whatever. And so then, their warm. So it's not really about the temperature of their blood. They're just very heavily dependent on the environment, moving to a warm area when they're cold, moving towards a shady area to cool off. So really dependent on the environment. Homeothermic or endothermic species refers to the use of internal physiological mechanisms to maintain a constant body temperature. So mammals have this, birds have this. We do, and to an extent, rely on the environment, but we have our own internal mechanisms that, regardless of what the regardless of what the environment temperature is, our body can maintain some temperature. And how we decrease temperature. For humans, we really only have one biological way to do that, which is to sweat. So we're sweating, trying to cool ourselves down. But of course, we know that we need to make sure we drink water to replace what we're sweating out. Otherwise, we can become dehydrated. Let's see, as far as behavioral actions, if we need to decrease temperature, we can maybe take off some clothes, find a cooler place on a hot day, like under the shade, become less active to avoid overheating. So really one biological process and then a few behavioral things we can do. In terms of increasing temperature, so biologically we can shiver. These are muscle contractions that can help generate heat. We can be more active. That can also help have muscle contractions and increase heat. We also tend to decrease blood flow to the skin, so that prevents the blood from cooling off too much. We keep the blood close to our internal organs so they stay warm, but then our skin feels cold. Mammals do this, not so much humans, but mammals that have fur can fluff up their fur to increase that insulation, which we don't have we don't have fur. We don't have a whole lot of hair around our body to do this. Although you might notice when you're cold, you get the goosebumps, and that's kind of like what's trying to happen. So the little tiny hairs on our skin is like fluffing up to keep us warmer. And behaviorally, we can put more clothes on. We can become more active. We can also huddle together with others. Oh yeah, there was sweating and shivering. There was that. And with the huddling, we see this in different species like penguins. Oh, they're so cute. All huddling together to try to keep warm. When we think back to those poikilothermic or ectothermic animals, when the temperature is freezing, that can be, dangerous for a lot of different species. But if their body temperature drops below freezing, ice crystals can form in the cells in the blood. They can die. A lot of amphibians and reptiles will burrow underground to avoid the cold. There are some species that have kind of antifreeze in their body, and they'll stock it in their blood and help, survive if they do freeze. Let's see, there's wood frogs that do freeze a little bit, and so they survive, at least some of them survive it, because first they'll kind of dehydrate their organs and blood vessels, and they'll kind of they have kind of this antifreeze. They have these chemicals that can cause like ice crystals to form more gradually. And then they also have really pretty amazing blood clotting capacity. So if there is any rupture to the blood vessels because of the ice, they can recover from that. Back to humans, basically, that we tend to keep a fairly constant high temperature around 98 degrees, which we have a lot of benefits, especially with muscle benefits. So one thing we see with species that have this warmer temperature, that having that muscle benefits, that if we need to move fast, if we need to run, we're pretty much ready for this. There will be less fatigue because we're already kind of warm. And of course, then you can think, oh, benefits of being warm, why aren't we warmer? And some disadvantages, and this would be for being higher than 98 degrees. 98 degrees is like kind of our normal, normal temperature. But having higher temperatures can have some higher costs. We're, of course, using more energy then. If the temperature is too high, it can break down some of our proteins. We know too that reproductive cells really require cooler temperatures. That's why we see birds laying egg and sitting on them rather than keeping them inside. In most male mammals, the scrotum are outside the body. In female, well, if we think about with humans, pregnant women are advised to avoid hot baths, avoid things that could harm the developing fetus. In terms of the brain, you might remember that we've talked about the hypothalamus as important for temperature regulation, among a lot of other functions. Hypothalamus does a lot of things. We have basically this area, the preoptic area, and the anterior hypothalamus. The preoptic area is right in front of the anterior hypothalamus, so we kind of combine it, POA, AH. That very much involved with monitoring the body's temperature. And actually how it does that is monitoring its own temperature. So if this part of the brain is warm, that means the body is warm. Similarly, if this part of the brain is cooler, that means the body is cooler. And so this is regardless of what the room temperature is, but kind of the brain is monitoring its own temperature as well as, of course, monitoring the body's temperature. And we can see a picture of this with the divisions of the hypothalamus, and then with the divisions of the hypothalamus. And, yeah. And then we mentioned before about fever. I'll just go ahead and put these all up. Fever is usually an increase in body temperature. The fever is our body's defense to illness. So not part of the illness itself, but our body's defense. That when there's bacteria, when there's virus or whatever invading the body, we have white blood cells that go and attack the intruders. The white blood cells release some proteins that stimulate the vagus nerve that sends signals to the hypothalamus. So kind of communicating with the hypothalamus, hey, this is what's going on. With the fever, this is an increased set point for your body temperature. So we remember we mentioned before about there might be some cases, some conditions where you want to change that set point. And so fever is one of them, that rather than having the normal 98 degrees, your body might increase that set point, make it a little bit higher, which can be helpful for battling and breaking down the bacteria or virus or whatever's got you. We see that fever can actually enhance the activity of the immune system. So in that case, you might not, or you can think about, do you want to take medication to reduce a fever? Because fevers can be helpful to a point. Because if we think about having that too high body temperature, that's not helpful. That can be dangerous. So generally a fever of 103 and above is something we want to avoid because that can cause harm to the body, that can break down proteins, things like that. So in that case, for sure, you would want to take medicine to try to reduce the fever. Okay, so this is the end of part 1, and then the next part will be about hunger.